Well, I bring you greetings from the folks at St. Paul, New Cumberland, and it's good to be here worshiping with you. Pastor Sigrid was at our place last week, and so it's wonderful to meet different congregations, and I hope it's good for you to meet different pastors as well. So don't look at your scriptures yet. Sometimes it's good to come at scriptures from the underside. So let me kind of set the setting here. I'm going to tell you a story about a woman. She was a slave woman, she had been taken from her homeland into the territory of what is now Israel and Palestine, to be sold as a slave to a mistress in a wealthy goat-herding, sheep-herding family. The woman's name was unimportant to her owners. Most often she was simply known as the slave woman. She had little to say about her future. She had no choice about becoming a sexual partner for her master in order to bear him a child, which her mistress was going to name and raise as her own. And after this slave woman became pregnant with the master's child, she was accused by her mistress of acting uppity and rude. It's not clear exactly what happened, but what is clear is that the mistress was unable to become pregnant, and she became jealous of the slave woman. So in order to put her in place, the mistress started abusing the slave woman with the master's knowledge. And when the slave could stand no more abuse, she ran away out into the wilderness, basically a desert, which was pretty much a death sentence for a pregnant woman alone with no water. But instead, it became the slave woman's, the beginning of her faith journey. And by now you may have guessed that her name is Hagar, and her master and mistress are Abraham and Sarah. And if you don't believe what I told you, you can look it up in the Bible. The great thing is, God did not abandon Hagar, but God sent an angel. And this is pretty amazing. Did you know that Hagar is the first person in the Bible to receive a visit from an angel? And the angel told Hagar to go back, but not before God, not her master, not her mistress, not before God gave Hagar's unborn child a name, Ishmael. Ishmael means God listens. So who are the Hagars in our world today? Who in our time needs to know that God is listening to their desperate situation? Well, it certainly wasn't freedom when God sent Hagar back to the temporary safety of Abraham's compound. But God did send her with a promise and with hope. God promised Hagar that her son Ishmael would have 12 sons and be the father of many nations. Funny, that's the same promise Abraham got, isn't it? But I'm jumping ahead. Back in the wilderness, There's another first for this Egyptian slave, the outsider, the runaway Hagar. She was the first and only person in the Bible to give God a name. And what did she call God? El Roi, which means the God who sees. After all, God had seen her wandering in the desert, and she found out it wasn't just Abraham's God, it was a God that saw her. And God had seen that Ishmael was inside her womb, and God had seen her future and her hopes, and God had called her by name, even if her mistress wouldn't. God valued Hagar. And so there in the desert was the beginning of her spiritual journey. It began with Hagar knowing that God listened to her and God saw her. There's a wideness in God's mercy that Abraham and Sarah didn't know yet. So Hagar went back to Abraham's camp and spent many more years living in the family compound. She and Sarah must have found a way to coexist. According to the narrator, Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. And then when Abraham was 100 years old, a son, Isaac, was finally born by Sarah. So toddler Isaac and teenager Ishmael were half-brothers. And Abraham's heart was big enough for both boys, but Sarah's wasn't. So listen as I read the rest of the story. The child Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. And then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. The word of the Lord. So apparently Sarah was filled with dread, understandably so, that Abraham would favor Ishmael over Isaac. The troubling part is that when Sarah insisted on Hagar being banished, God seemed to side with Sarah, telling Abraham to let her go. Let Ishmael go. This time the journey was not Hagar's choice. This time she was losing her tenuous place in that family. This time she was lost in the middle of nowhere with no water. This time her son seemed to have been rejected by his father, although there are indications in the Bible that that was only temporary. If you keep reading, you find out that when Abraham died, both Isaac and Ishmael were there at the funeral. And there's a tradition in the Quran that Abraham kept visiting Isaac even though they weren't together. But for now, from Hagar's perspective, it must have looked like God had abandoned her along with Abraham and Sarah, even forgotten his promise of Ishmael having 12 sons because he was about to die of thirst under the bush. But here's the irony in Hagar's story. Abraham and Sarah participated in pushing Hagar out. But it appears that God had an undercover plot to get Hagar out into the desert for part 2 of her spiritual journey. God says, Hagar, you think you're abandoned and alone? Oh no, I'm actually keeping my promise to you. Hagar, you think you've been rejected by Abraham? Guess what? I am finally setting you free to be a slave no longer. Hagar, you think you and your son are dying? Well, my angel's trying to show you where a well of water is. Yes, there in the desert, Hagar learned how very precious she and her son were to God. The desert became a life-giving journey. The once powerless woman was able to make a new home for her son. The once enslaved woman was given freedom. The once rejected woman was going to have a house full of 12 grandsons. The once silenced woman spoke with God. All right. As Christians, you and I are used to modeling our faith after Abraham and Sarah, right? But listening to the story from the underside, from Hagar's perspective, invites us to model our faith after God, to get out there in the desert with God. God cares for those on the margins who are different than us. God hears the voice of the powerless and the used and the abused. God names people who are ignored by others. And God's plan works against, in the end, the systems of oppression. And don't forget that we know this because Jesus spent a lot of time with people like Hagar. So, what if, at least for a few minutes, we stopped thinking of our congregations as respectable places, but started thinking of our congregations, this space, as a desert place? Places where people who are abandoned can run to. Places where people who are told they are nobodies can hear their names said with love and respect. Places where people find out in amazement that God really does hear them and God really does see them. Places where the refugee finds shelter. Places where advocates will see the injustice and then do something about changing the system. Places where spiritual journeys and encounters begin with baptism. Places where people learn to trust God's promise of grace and forgiveness, no matter who they are, and be set free. Places where strangers find a home, because there's such a wideness in God's mercy. Thanks be to God.